That's a good idea. Yeah, yeah.
Absorbing foam would probably be better and cheaper. Especially now that you can get it on TV for like 50p. No way. And the tears of slave children. The salt and gives it a special kind of crystal structure.
So I'll just wait a couple more minutes just to see if anyone else shows up, and then we'll get started. Okay then, folks, we'll get started. Thanks. I often find whenever I go to like a stand-up gig, if I sit at the front, I always get picked on. Like I've got one of those faces, but I'm not going to pick on you until Professor Scott.
And I'm specifically sitting here so you don't.
Yeah. But no, I went to a circus once with my nieces, and I ended up in the middle of the ring, miming guitar with a mop. Yeah, so I don't know what it is. It's something about. No. Great. So thanks for coming, everyone. I was going to start with a little bit of an introduction as to who I am, but we all know each other in the room, so I can kind of skip that part. But just to say, you might not be aware that I work quite closely with Francisca on a project called Bridging the Gap. And really, that project is interested in understanding how blind and visually impaired people use music software, essentially, digital audio workstations. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is based on a thematic analysis of some interview data, some interview transcripts from interviews with 20, we describe them as sound creatives because they kind of fall into where it's a really broad area of discipline. So we spoke to sound designers, composers, musicians, DJs as well. So yeah, we had a chat to them just to try and understand three things, I guess. Firstly, which tools were they using and what were their workflows? Secondly, were they experiencing any problems or any barriers in using those tools? And then thirdly, had they devised any workarounds, I guess, for kind of overcoming or removing those barriers? So before I get kind of too far into things, I'm going to take a little bit of a sidestep and ask you what might seem like a bit of a random question. So I want to kind of like do a bit of a litmus test in the room. So I'm going to make a statement, and I'd like you to raise your hand as high as you can if you agree strongly with that statement. Obviously, if you don't agree with it at all, keep your hand down. And if you're somewhere in the middle, then just put your hand at appropriate height. So this is the statement. So cars were initially a useful technology, but now they do more harm than good. Interesting. Okay. So yeah, kind of mixed responses. Seems all of you kind of partially agree with that statement. There are a couple of hands raised quite high, and everyone else is sort of around the middle, I guess. Okay, one more statement for you. This one's a little bit more controversial. Formal education can be a powerful force in excluding some people from society. Interesting, yeah. So we've probably got some more people, a greater number of you have raised your hands more highly. And of course, you can kind of take a few different things from that statement, and this probably means something slightly different to each of you. Okay, so remember those statements and your response to them, and we'll come back to those a little bit later. So I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about theory from disability studies. I'm going to do a little bit of design theory and a little bit of theory from human-computer interaction. So what I'd like to introduce first are these three models of disability. So three ways to kind of conceptualize or think about disability. There are many more models, but I've just kind of chosen three. Does anyone know what one of the most prevalent models of disability is at all? Any suggestions? Okay. Well, I'm going to talk about the medical model of disability initially. So this kind of came about with the advent of modern medicine. And really, to put it in a nutshell, it views disability as a disorder, as an illness, something which is identified by a medical professional, and it's the role of the medical professional to determine the best course of treatment. So in its kind of worst manifestation, I guess, the patient or the person who has an impairment is seen as a non-expert. Their opinion doesn't really matter. It's all about the opinions of the medical professional and what they deem to be the best way to address that disability, to fix it, to cure it. Okay, so the second model of disability is the social model of disability. Now this kind of came a little bit later on, around the 1970s, and it was in tandem with the independent living movement in the United States. And the social model of disability is a term that was coined by a social worker, disabled social worker called Mike Oliver. And he had an interesting perspective. He said that people aren't disabled by their impairments, but rather they're disabled by the attitudes and actions of society. So a common example of that is how a wheelchair user might be disabled from entering a building if that building, if the only way to enter that building is through a flight of stairs. So in that situation, the people who were tasked with commissioning the building and designing the building, they had an idea of what a typical person would be who would enter that building, you know. And that typical person was not a wheelchair user. They might have not even thought about wheelchair users. They might have considered them and perhaps thought it wasn't important to include wheelchair users. So it's a really interesting perspective and slightly more liberal than the problematic medical model. Then the third model of disability, and this is just very briefly, is the charity model of disability. So this kind of sees disabled people as vulnerable, helpless, and in need of help, particularly from a non-disabled person. Now, while we could say that of anyone, you know, regardless of disability, that they might be vulnerable in need of help, we can't make that generalization against any group of people. It's problematic. Okay. 3 models of disability. 3 is going to be a magic number today because we've got 3 waves of human-computer interaction that we're going to talk about now. So people who are sort of involved in researching the way that we interact with machines and designing interactions widely kind of agree that we've moved through 3 waves of thought, or even 3 models or 3 perspectives on what's important when we design machines and what we should measure, I guess, really. Now, these 3 waves I'm going to tell you about in a minute, they came in a sort of chronological order, but they all exist today. So if you're kind of reading current research papers, they're probably going to fit within one of these 3 models. They might be even sort of fit in a bit of a combination of 2 or 3 even. So the first model was, I guess it came post-industrial revolution. And it was a point when I guess we were concerned with how efficiently we can produce products. Therefore, the things that are important, really, I guess, are the efficiency of machine use. Things like safety and comfort also become important. But really, this is kind of, you know, when we're testing systems, when we're researching systems, we're kind of thinking about how efficient individual users can interact with that machine, how efficiently. Now, the second wave of HCI, it was informed by the cognitive science revolution. So this really sees the human brain as an information processor. And really, this is all about the efficient transfer of information between a machine as an information processor and a human as an information processor as well. Now, in this particular wave, the context kind of broadens beyond individual users of technology. It kind of broadens out to communities of practice, but specifically within a workplace environment. So researchers are kind of interested in, I guess, how people share knowledge in that environment, how they train one another, how they work collectively with technology. The third wave of HCI, the context kind of broadens even further, and we start to kind of think about technology use outside the workplace and for things that aren't related to work. So it might be for making art, making music, things that are kind of relevant to all of us in the room. And also, there's a recognition that technology use may not necessarily be purposeful or even rational. So think about sort of phone scrolling, for instance, is one example, you know. So it kind of tries to embrace like the messy and complex nature of life. Now, there is a 4th wave. Well, it's kind of under debate, really, I guess, what a 4th wave of HCI might be. And one of the sort of proposals I find quite compelling is how we might return to a time where we craft the tools that we use. So what I mean by that is currently, for the most part, we have a situation where the design of an object and the use of an object, design time and use time, is very separate. So we have a bunch of designers they do the design thing, they finish the design, and then they send the product off to the customer, and then they use it, really. And there might be a little bit of feedback between the two, but they're very distinct. back when we were hunter-gatherers, it was very likely that the people using tools were the people who crafted them. And because of that, they were in a position where they could recraft, they could iterate, they could improve. So, you know, the huntsperson with a spear might have noticed that a certain design is more aerodynamic, a certain sort of length of spike at the end is more efficient, so on and so forth. The problem we have at the moment is like all of our devices are kind of composite, really. They're made up of so many different materials, processes, and specialisms, I guess, that it's very hard for an end user, I think, to kind of, you know, if you think about me and my smartphone, there's very little customization I can do here. I mean, I can change the screensaver on it. But yeah, it's kind of, I'm quite constrained, you know, and if I feel that there's something that this phone isn't doing, it's not meeting my requirements, then there's very little I can do about it. Okay. So, access tools. So this is kind of more broadly speaking in the context of visual impairment and blindness. So the majority of visually impaired and blind people, well, the most popular tool, the most common tool used by this particular group of people is the built-in kind of system zoom. So system navigation, where you can just increase the size of a particular area on a screen, make it larger, make it more easy to view. Second to that is the screen reader. So does anyone know what a screen reader is or has used one? Yeah, most people here. Great. Yeah. So so with that, it's kind of there's two halves to the interaction between with a screen reader and a computer. So we have a QWERTY keyboard, which is used to kind of navigate the parameters of your software. So that could be, you could navigate between sections of a user interface. You could navigate between menu items. And as you select items on your menu or parameters in your software, then the parameter name and sometimes its value is read back to you in a synthesized voice. So it's a highly popular way of interacting with a computer if you're blind. The difficulty that we have is that this method of interaction was really designed for office tools, you know, for word processors, for email clients, that kind of thing. When we start thinking about sort of music making, it becomes a little bit problematic because we're interested in the audio domain. You know, we're working with sound, audio, music. But then also we've got this kind of synthesized voice, which is potentially giving us interruptions really as we work. What was really interesting with the 20 participants that we spoke to, the majority of them didn't really see it as a problem. And I think the reason for that is, for a lot of the participants, that was the primary way of interacting with a computer. So that was their sole experience, I guess, and therefore there wasn't really a comparison point. And for the majority of people, it wasn't a problem, it's just the way things are. We did speak to one person who had set up a separate audio feed for their screen reader voice, which was separate to his music, his audio. But yeah, for the most part, people just sort of accepted it. Now, the other type of access tool, which is a bit of a funny one, it's strange to call it a tool really, but it's kind of, it's more of a workaround. We find that with music software, often people are using plugins from different manufacturers, third-party manufacturers, and the accessibility of those plugins can kind of vary quite a bit. Some plugins might be compatible with a screen reader, they might work well with a screen reader, but the installer for that plugin isn't. So that's really frustrating, you know, if you're kind of trying to install software that does work, but you know, it's actually the installation process which is the barrier. So in sort of situations like that, people would sometimes ask for sighted assistance, you know, whether it's a family member or a friend, just to kind of jump on the computer and click the OK button, whatever it might be, to kind of move on to the next step. Okay, so there are 3 digital audio workstations which are commonly used by blind and visually impaired people. Does anyone want to have a guess as to what one of those might be? Ableton, no. So with Ableton, the experience of Ableton up until recently was it was not compatible with a screen reader whatsoever. But they've recently, with Live 12, it is now it has a fairly sophisticated amount of compatibility with screen readers. So they've kind of really pushed to kind of be inclusive, I guess, in their design.
Indeed, they've employed a specific person to
Yeah.
do that since
Yeah.
we started.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So they've got somebody leading the way at Ableton for accessibility. But good guess anyway. So any other suggestions?
Reaper?
Yes, which is a really interesting one because Reaper, it's not, arguably it's not that popular in industry, but it's very popular in education, and I think, possibly it's due to the fact that you can avoid buying a license for it for a very long time if you wanted to. Yeah.
73 days.
Yeah, that's it. To wait 20 seconds for the box to go by. So that's probably the most popular DAW of the participants we spoke to. Number 2 on the list is Pro Tools, okay, which is great. It has a certain degree of accessibility out of the box, and it's obviously an industry standard tool as well. And then number 3 is Logic, okay. So 2 of those, I should say, with Pro Tools, it's only really running on the Mac that it kind of works well with a screen reader. On Windows, it's not really an option. And of course, Logic is Mac only. Now, with each of these DAWs, there's room for improvement, I guess, out of the box. So with Reaper, some of you might be aware that they have an API, it's called Reaper Extensions, and it opens up, I guess, the nuts and bolts of Reaper to allow people to kind of write extensions using C++. And because they've kind of opened things up in that way, this open source project, Asara, has really been used to kind of augment the screen reader experience with Reaper and the usability, I guess, of Reaper considerably. So there's a community of primarily blind and visually impaired programmers who are developing this tool. And they're sharing it freely along, within online communities. Pro Tools, they actually had a blinds producer who was fairly high level working at Avid for some time. Flow Tools is an extension which really improves, I guess, the usability of Pro Tools. So yes, it is compatible out of the box with screen readers, but there are some improvements which can be made. Improvements which are offered by Flow Tools, and again, it's another open source project, and it's shared through online communities. And then lastly, we've got Keyboard Ninja. So this is a set of shortcuts for Logic, which extend the number of, I guess, keyboard shortcuts that you can use to kind of execute functions and features in a sort of click of a button, really. So that kind of helps to avoid a lot of this sort of linear navigation of menus. One participant we spoke to had memorized up to about 300 keyboard shortcuts. And it was incredible watching him use his computer keyboard, because some of the shapes he was making with his fingers, he was holding down sort of 4 or 5 keys at a time. It was almost like fretting a guitar or playing chords on a piano. Those shapes have been committed to memory, and you could kind of execute them really quickly. So we've got these kind of free solutions, and they're kind of being bolstered, they're being improved by these open source projects. So we conducted a thematic analysis on our interview data with these 20 visually impaired and blind music makers, and we identified that there are 3 gaps, 3 barriers, which are kind of, I guess, in a nutshell, really they're obstructing visually impaired and blind people in their development as music makers, as audio engineers, obstructing them in their education, in their development, really, I guess, overall. So the first gap, and we've spoken about this a little bit already, is technology, okay? So we've got those 3 DAWs, they're kind of partially there, but still we've got communities of practice who are kind of, I guess, improving them. The experiences with other DAWs and other plugins as well can really vary quite a lot. And I think it's probably one of those 3 options, I guess, it's really going to be your best bet if you're a visually impaired and blind music maker. The second gap is in education, and this is really where we heard of a few experiences where people had been at a college or a university and the lecturer really wasn't aware of accessible workflows or accessible alternatives to these software packages. So I've got a couple of quotes here from some of our participants. So first one's from Nick. So he's a guy in the States, and this was an experience at college. One of the big things was that my instructors were kind of like, I don't know how you're going to do that because it's visual. And I tried to explain the screen reader thing, and basically they had it all made up in their minds already that there was no way I was going to be able to read those levels. So yeah, so kind of really kind of pushing back on his insistence that there is an accessible workflow available. Second quote I've got here is from Peter. So he's a professional audio engineer. He works for the BBC, freelance now, so he's a bit older. He says, I think it's hardly ever a question of not wanting to help or having the wrong attitude. It's much more that they, the educators, just don't know what's feasible, and they tend to assume that things are not feasible by default. So, yeah, it's kind of interesting. I think those kind of comments really tie into this next gap. There's a gap in information, really. You know, if you're just starting out, if you're a blind or visually impaired person who's interested in making music or working with sound creatively, unfortunately you won't be able to find information about what's accessible on the websites of manufacturers, and particularly so because some of these DAWs really rely on these third-party solutions to kind of improve the accessibility. So there's a lack of information. So it's only really if you're kind of connected with one of these online communities that you'll really kind of, I guess, get your foot in the door and start to develop. I'm just going to turn the temperature down a bit. Is that all right for everyone? Oh, it's quite warm, yeah. So 23, I think. So I'm just going to bring it down to 17. But give me a shout if you. Yeah. I was running a group in here the other day, and one of the participants put their gloves on. I was like, oh, it's a sure side. It's too cold. So I better turn it up. Okay, so where were we? So a gap in information, and even like, you know, because a lot of manufacturers of software, they'll produce a whole bunch of videos, how to use their software, how to make XYZ genre of music, but you'll find that all of those tutorials they're designed from a visual perspective. You know, it's kind of common for someone giving a tutorial on YouTube, for instance, to say, right, click here, drag this over here, watch out for the level doesn't clip over here, you know. So it's kind of, I think it is the case that although subtle, I think the workflow of many blind and visually impaired people using music software is slightly, it's different to the sighted workflow, and therefore a good tutorial would have different cues, I guess, really, to guide someone through using a feature. So I've kind of been hinted at this as I've been going along, but it's really the work of these communities of practice that's kind of solving these issues. So we've got, we've spoken about the blind and visually impaired developers who are kind of developing tech to kind of developing open source scripts to kind of improve the functionality of DAWs. But what they're also doing is they're kind of educating each other, so they're kind of sharing tips and tricks on music production techniques. They're sharing accessible workflows. So it's kind of interesting, it's, in a way it is a community of musical practice, but they're not sharing a repertoire of music. I suppose they're sharing a repertoire of accessibility workflows and related things, really. So here we can see that, I guess the participants we spoke to, they don't fit that charity model of disability at all, really. Quite to the contrary, they're kind of doing a lot of stuff themselves, quite independently. And you could ask the question, is it fair, that these communities have to put in that extra legwork to make their doors as functional as a door is for a sighted person? You could ask that question. I don't know what the answer is to that. I mean, the majority of people that we spoke to were very happy to kind of contribute to the communities. They're very passionate and driven about sort of sharing their skills, their knowledge, their resources, and helping others to kind of develop their craft. These are just 3 of the groups that we spoke to. It's a great name at the top, I think, but it's a bit tongue-in-cheek. Okay, so now we're going to talk about this interesting book from a philosopher called Ivan Illich. Okay, so he kind of, he's often described as a Christian anarchist. I think that's a great description. I'd love to have a chat with him, but he's no longer with us, unfortunately. But so he wrote this book, Tools for Conviviality. And he argued, really, in this book, that tools, and he uses that term to describe, I guess, technologies, systems, institutions. He argues that while a lot of tools start off as initially useful, they pass through this second watershed where they start to have more negative impacts than positive. So one example of that is with the car, and you may or may not agree with this. I think some of you might agree. Back in the 1920s, when the car first emerged, it made it easier for us to travel long distances. You know, we could travel further in a shorter amount of time. At some point over the last sort of 100 years, we reached a point where society almost expects people to travel further. So it's kind of a bit of a paradox, really. You know, I guess like I don't know what the average commute is, but I guess it probably is like half an hour for traveling in and out of work. And it wouldn't have been the case, I guess, back in the 1920s. You can kind of extend this example and think about, like, I guess, how long we spend in our cars actually moving and how often we're actually just stuck in a traffic jam. And we can think about like the human and the environmental costs of cars and infrastructure. I mean, I'm not sure the percentage of land mass that we've covered with tarmac, but I reckon it's a large amount, really. We've kind of transformed the surface of the planet in order to incorporate this technology. So going back to our statement about formal education excluding people from society, so Illich would say that a certain amount of schooling is important for all people, but the problem emerges when you kind of fall outside of that system. You know, if the type of education that's being given isn't suited to your learning requirements, if that education isn't affordable for you, if there's anything stopping you from kind of following that path, there's a chance that you're going to drop out, and opportunities that follow on from that educational program are going to be closed to you. And we saw this with some of our participants as well. So, you know, the educators weren't able to provide guidance on an accessible workflow. Therefore, the participants weren't reaching the grades that they should be expected to reach, and they're not potentially sort of moving further on, you know, in their academic career. So I think it's kind of interesting to kind of think about conviviality, I guess, as a way to kind of address things. I mean, I'm sort of hesitant to say that because at the moment, as I mentioned, it's like these communities are doing a lot to address things themselves, really, you know. Anyway, let's talk a little bit more about conviviality. So you could define it as the ability of individuals to interact creatively and autonomously with others and their environment to satisfy their own needs. So we've kind of seen that partially within these communities that we've looked at. You know, there have been some opportunities for them to kind of act creatively and autonomously with these frameworks, with the Reaper extensions, with Flow Tools and Keyboard Ninja. So for a tool to be convivial, it needs to be easy to use. It must be possible for an individual to learn the use of a tool intuitively through interaction with minimal instruction. So that's kind of a great goal. It's probably quite hard to achieve, I guess, particularly in a lot of the tools that maybe we might see around SARC and digital audio workstations. But, you know, for somebody to learn that tool intuitively, for them to learn a DAW intuitively, reduces the dependence on formal education, really, I guess. That's really what it's coming down to. A convivial tool allows the user to decide when and where the tool is used. So one concern that came back from our participants is that, I guess, like, if you think of the typical sort of music production setup, you know, it's an ecology of a number of different artifacts. You have a DAW, you maybe have a few plugins, maybe some hardware, audio interface speakers, MIDI controllers, so on and so forth. So VIB music makers are kind of adding to this with scripts, extensions, additional bits of hardware. So, you know, for instance, like this Braille display that I've got here. And because of that, it's very hard for them to kind of transplant their very unique setup into a professional studio environment. You can imagine them sort of going, I don't know, someone going to Abbey Road, for instance, say, I'd just like to install all these open source tools on your Pro Tools machine, please. And, you know, I imagine the engineer would probably have a few things to say about that. So, you know, if we had a base level of sophisticated accessibility in our tools already, you know, perhaps it's easier then for a blind or visually impaired sound creative to kind of work in a professional studio. And then lastly, convivial tools can adapt to the user's preferences. And we've heard this before, right, with accessible technology, or, you know, it's kind of adaptability is important. But I think that, you know, it's kind of important, I guess, not just for disabled people, but for everyone, really. If we accept that we're going to sort of craft our tools, if our ideas of how our tools are going to develop over time, then it's important for those tools to be flexible. So where does this lead us to? Really, I guess the message here that, you know, if you're involved in designing technology, then it's valuable to think about designing for designers, okay, and not designing for users. There's this kind of interesting perspective from meta design, which says that essentially there's no such thing as a user, right? And that argument comes from a place, I guess the rationale is that there can't be a user of something that doesn't exist. Okay, so if you're designing something new, of course there isn't somebody using that already. Now you can kind of get closer to understanding how that particular object that you're designing might be used by talking to people you might think are a representative user or have used similar things before in the past. But the point still remains that it's all speculation. So if we embrace that potential fourth wave of human-computer interaction, think about users as designers, as human crafters, not working independently, but working in interdependent communities, these convivial spaces, and I think will go a long way to kind of producing tools which are of benefit to people. So we cannot anticipate how an object is used or how an object will connect to a community or all of the other artifacts being used in that community. So therefore it's very important to leave that flexibility. So I'm just going to finish on a quote from academic Cynthia Bennett. She says, "Access is not only a solution to a disability-related barrier, it's a way of being together and helping one another." And I think if we can design our tools to support those goals, then we'll be in a good place. So yeah, thanks very much. And time for questions.
Braille reader? Or?
No, I sort of skipped over it actually, but yeah, this is a really interesting device. It's kind of a Braille display, which is a way of, there are 16 cells here, each of which has like a 2x8 pin array, and the pins can be either raised or depressed to represent different characters on the screen. These keys also kind of input Braille characters as well. Yeah, they're more expensive than you might think. How much do you think this costs? Anyone got an idea?
600 pounds.
Bang on, yeah. Did I tell you?
Looks like a third person on Amazon.
Yeah. So interestingly, the majority of the people that we spoke to don't use Braille. And I think maybe the reason for that is that they tended to be a little bit younger, and I think that the screen reader offers an awful lot. If you have access to a computer and access to a screen reader, then maybe it leaves Braille a little bit redundant. But that's, I guess, could be debated, really. But,
no, but I think you're right there. I was recently at a Seamus Centre, kind of a little poetry event, reading Braille, and there was a range of different ages, but that conversation came up saying that not a lot of younger people even start learning Braille, visually impaired people, because of screen readers, and actually there was a blind woman in the room who was just using a phone anywhere to have everything translated and so on. So I think Braille, maybe is going a little out of fashion.
Out of fashion, yeah.
Although it's becoming back in fashion because most of us were sighted people in the room trying to read poetry because of the tactile thing, which is of course very beautiful if you manage to read it, but we're all using our eyes to see the knobs.
Sure. It's also very interesting with, I guess, with Braille music as well, because I guess most traditional instruments you need two hands, I guess, to play them, and so it's kind of a little bit clunky to then have to sort of use touch with one of your hands to kind of read the music at the same time. So it's
good
yeah.
for singers, maybe.
Good for singers, yeah. So yeah.
I was just thinking, like, it takes less than a second for someone who can see, without visual impairment, to turn off accessibility settings. Why not just have them implemented by default and just turn them off? Like, because I know there's some games that do that as well, where you turn on your game, you install the game, first menu, it reads out the menu too, and it's like, do you want visual impairment, like auto reader? No. It's like less than a second.
Yeah, that's a really good point actually. I think that could be designed in, and maybe you can speculate that it comes down to this idea of, I guess, we spoke about the typical person using this building without the ramp to access it. Maybe there's an idea of a typical DAW user who isn't visually impaired, and perhaps people are kind of catering towards that experience rather than the blind experience.
But a good example for a convivial tool, right? Just have it as inclusive maybe, and then you can opt out. Opt out rather than opt in.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, that's a good point, Alex. Cool.
I wondered if you might talk a bit about education, because it's like educating who or whom, education for whom, because there's obviously different facets to this education piece, not just actually educating the visually impaired community, but educating people like us, right?
Yeah, I guess it's sort of one thing that we have seen, which is really positive, is a lot of manufacturers are now sort of pushing for accessibility. So one of the most popular frameworks that you'll know about, Alex, Juice, is it switches on accessibility tags on the UI elements by default. So with kind of one fell swoop, a whole number of different software plugins have got some level of screen reader compatibility. There's still like yes, you can expose all these parameters to the screen reader, but sometimes you'll find that the screen reader will jump around. So it might start off with like parameter 1 of a filter and then jump to parameter 4 of an envelope in a very illogical way. So we kind of not only need to kind of, expose to the screen reader, we need to kind of think about usability, I guess.
Yeah, so would that be based on, would it be reading, like, it's not reading based on the graphical element of the UI, would it be reading on where the parameters are put in the actual code?
Yeah. And so that's kind of interesting, really. So I guess, so in a way, we've kind of sort of jumped over that need to kind of educate people, but we still, we've brought a base level of screen reader compatibility just by changing the tools that everybody uses. But there still is a sort of an argument for kind of educating developers on what is usable and what's not, when you're interacting with a computer in that way.
Interesting. So next research project, I guess, for us to also think, what is the next gap that we might be thinking about?
Yeah, a question just because it's always a very potentially polemic topic to discuss, and I was wondering, what do you think about hierarchies of disabilities? In the sense, this is a very specific disability, and in this, blind people, and we are making a typical blind person
Yep.
who has use of two hands
Mm.
to navigate a keyboard. So you know, the disabilities are such a range of, you know, of different challenges and different gaps with different sets of interest. And I find it very interesting that, you know, there is these communities of practice of, you know, the people making the tools for themselves,
Mm.
and there's, you know, there is kind of the helping. I think it's fair and it's great that they are doing it, because on the other hand you have the you know, the savior
Yes, yeah. Like
complex thing
yeah.
of coming
Yeah.
and I'm gonna solve this for you
Yeah.
because there's something wrong with you, and I will, you know, use my altruism. So I just wonder what you think about, you know, all these interconnected issues
Yeah.
that you know, the paths to exclusion are multiple varied, and almost any solution can create a problem for a different type of user.
Yeah, it kind of ties into that idea of universal design, really, I guess, as well, in that sort of trying to be inclusive of as many different people as possible in one design. And it's kind of like a little bit, I think you're quite right, it is a challenge, you know, and possibly impossible, you know, to kind of create an object which is usable by any number of persons in society. So yeah, I mean, in my PhD, I sort of addressed that, I guess, by arguing for bespoke design, really, I guess. So being able to kind of tailor unique solutions to individual people, or for individual people to kind of tailor their own solutions. So it does tie into this idea of conviviality, of kind of working in communities of different expertise, you know, having the freedom to kind of work with your tools to kind of modify them to meet a particular requirement. But I think if I'm honest, it's still quite a sort of lofty, slightly fluffy kind of approach, really, and sort of what that means in sort of real terms in practice. Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that question at the moment, really. Yeah.
One quick follow-up. I'm just wondering, I'm sure you must have come across the haptic wave
Yes. Yeah.
project that Alan Parkinson was working some years ago. Are there any developments in that, you know, moving away from or complementing the screen reader with actual, you know, touch or other forms that give, you know, a better representation of graphics?
Yeah, so the haptic wave, for those of you who maybe haven't come across it, I mean, it's kind of ironic that a lot of music software is highly visual, and like the waveform display is a really good example of that. So the haptic wave was a research project from Goldsmiths, is that right? And they hacked a printer, took a couple of rails off of a regular printer and put a motorized fader on these rails. And the idea is you can kind of scrub back and forth across a waveform, and then the height of the motorized fader would kind of represent the amplitude of the waveform. And then once you found a part that you want to kind of edit, then you can sort of, you know, cut or splice, whatever it might be. So unfortunately for that project, so it hasn't developed any further, and it's non-functioning, I think, the prototypes that they had now. In terms of that kind of idea of, you know, using haptics as a way to kind of interact or convey information from a DAW, there's a really interesting example. It was called the haptic EQ. So this was using an idea of the curve of a graphical EQ. So it's a large A3 sheet of paper, I believe, with a length of chain on it. And the idea is using computer vision, you know, as a camera mounted above, you could kind of move this chain to kind of represent an EQ curve. That was really interesting. But I think the challenge with a lot of these products is they're kind of, we've spoken about this before, where they're kind of developed for a research project, but then it's really kind of given them some life afterwards as a real challenge, you know. And one possible solution to that was somebody we work with, Christina, who was looking at repurposing the motors in a mobile phone. to kind of provide some haptic feedback. So you could have your phone buzz, for instance, when you clip on a particular channel, that kind of thing. And I think that kind of approach is promising because it's kind of using tech that everyone, it's everyday tech that people have access to, really. Rather than a sort of bespoke creation for a research project.
Just need to convince the likes of Apple and Google, but it's interesting what you said about altruism, because I think there is money in altruism, and because we've seen it in Google and one of those online seminars, and Google was all over it saying, oh, we are all about accessibility now, and look over there, we have a whole department of people just doing accessibility, and was, I don't know though how much they're actually doing, but I think to be seen, obviously, to be as inclusive as possible. Mm. And I'm not saying that for anyone on the camera, I'm not saying that Google isn't, but it's quite hard then to have some of these projects, to have a life beyond and say, well, here, Apple, why aren't you making a phone that could do other things, or bring these ideas to the likes of Google, where we think they might have money to do it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Actually, I have a question. Sorry.
Yeah.
So I too admire the fact that visually impaired people have a community and they are trying to develop and design technology for their own purposes.
Yeah.
Has there been any interaction with? Have you come across any instances where people from this community have interacted with people with maybe a different kind of disability and gleaned some ideas from how they address their
No, yeah, I can't really think of any specific examples other than the fact that some of the people that we spoke to are connected to Drake Music and in England, and they sort of have quite a large remit, and they work with people with a range of impairments to access music. So, but as far as to my knowledge, I haven't seen any kind of transfer of kind of accessible workflows from one disability to another. But that could have happened, absolutely.
Are you thinking of anything in particular, like movement, or got something in mind?
Nothing in particular, but maybe just some general design workflows. Maybe
very interesting.
Yeah. It's that is interesting. What we have seen is a degree of communication between some of the communities and manufacturers as well. So Native Instruments have been particularly good. They've devised a plug-in framework which is fully screen reader compatible. The only caveat is that you have to buy their MIDI controller in order to use it. Because Ableton is another good example that we mentioned earlier. And Focusrite as well, so they're more in the sort of domain of kind of hardware, really, I guess. But they've been thinking a lot about accessibility. So one example is their VU LEDs on their audio interfaces used to go between red and green, which isn't that great for someone with red-green colour blindness, for instance. So they've kind of changed that to kind of give feedback via different, but yeah, so different patterns of LEDs flashing, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's a long road, I think. Yeah, but there's certainly work being done, which is quite sort of promising, really. Great. Well, thanks for coming along, everyone. I hope that was interesting, and have a chocolate on the way out if you like.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, go for it.